Number 1. I've come here not only for closure, but more importantly to see if anyone has ever seen something quite like this. I also feel it's my duty to help protect anyone from this happening to them. My name is Joshua. I decided to become a psychiatric nurse because helping people was one of my passions. I sure as hell racked up a lot of student debt, and although the paycheck of merely 133,000 a year makes my countless years of university debt shrink more and more, the chronic debt of a scarred mind is something that will never be rejuvenated. People often don't see why I quit my profession, a great salary and amazing coworkers, as well as something I was passionate about, would be a dream for many. Usually, when asked why I chose to step down from my profession, I make up a bullshit excuse, such as sleep deprivation, but the truth is something far more sinister. Before the closing down of Riverview Mental Health Facility in British Columbia, I was a full time psych nurse at that location. My job was to check in on the patients, make sure they were taking their meds, and report back to the medical staff. There was one patient who always stuck out to me. For confidentiality purposes, we will give him the name Gary. Gary was 5'9", brown hair similar to hazelnut. His complexion was pale and ghostly. The color of green veins was seen easily through his light skin. He was extremely skinny and lanky. Gary was brushed off by many of my coworkers as being a paranoid schizophrenic, but as he was one of my main patients, he was much different in my eyes. In fact, I was under the strong belief he had nothing mental going on at all, rather a full blown possession. Before Gary, I thought nothing paranormal existed, but now I see that paranormal possessions are a very real thing. Gary would always go on about experiences and stories of his past to me, something a lot of my patients didn't choose to speak about. Gary had nothing to be ashamed of. He grew up in the small Canadian village of Camrose, Alberta. He was an outstanding student, getting nothing below perfect marks. He moved to a province over to attend the University of British Columbia. Although Gary doesn't recall most of his life after moving to British Columbia, some of my senior coworkers often told me about his story. Upon moving, he started having vivid nightmares. Each time and time again, Gary would question why his mind was creating such intense, scary, and dark images. A few months go by, and Gary would wake up on a beautiful sun-risen morning, feeling as if summer shanties were upbeat and in tune with his very soul. But Gary noticed something. Gary had bruises, scratches, and cuts that he could not remember how they were inflicted towards him. He brushed it off as him being clumsy in bed. All this changed on a midsummer's night for Gary. He woke up in a cold sweat at approximately 2:30 in the morning, and an intense feeling of drowned sorrow. He was feeling incredibly uncomfortable, which soon turned to shock after he saw his very own arm moving without his knowledge, sawing his entire left leg off. Gary couldn't stop. Gary was so infatuated, but scarred at the same time. He let out a blood curdling scream for his roommates to call the police. Gary made it in an ambulance on time, and after countless immediate doses of fentanyl and restraint so entangled in his arms that not a single muscle could be moved, he was on the road to recovery. His left leg had to be amputated to prevent infectious complications. Gary's admittance to our institute was different. As many of our patients have explainable illnesses, Gary seems to have much larger toll on not only his mind but his body. Gary's body cannot regulate his own temperature, and it can raise at any moment with no warning. This was troubling for the medical staff, as very little treatments proved effective to help him. Gary had less cognitive function than most the last time I saw him, and other than the odd vivid dreams and ungodly beings he sees in them, he almost has no mental setbacks. He continues to try every method known to hurt himself, which is why he spent a large amount of time in the cushioned room, which is essentially a room full of soft material. It is very clear that he wishes nothing but peace to the bridge of his mind and body. You may just think that it's a regular mental illness or something paranormal, even. But the worst part isn't Gary himself, it's the institution of Riverview. Riverview closed down in July of 2012, and a large portion of the patients were just released back into society. This is why Vancouver has a rather large homeless population. One of the patients who got released was Gary. My heart continues to sink to this day whilst questioning what Gary could potentially do while in society. Could this demon spread? Could it multiply? What will Gary do next? Will he hurt himself and others? These are the questions that still plague me today. One thing's for certain: if you see a man with an amputated left leg on the streets of the greater Vancouver area, run. Run as fast as you can, because you're not looking at an average homeless man. You're looking at a demon manifesting itself inside of a human. Number two. I've been depressed for as long as I can remember. It's eaten away at me my entire life, and one night in April 2017, I decided I didn't want to exist anymore. My plan was to sneak off the bridge near my house and do the deed. It was definitely far enough of a drop to do the job. The night comes, and I sneak out and begin the mile walk to the bridge. On the walk there, I notice how crazy dark it is. No crickets, no cars, nothing, just darkness. After a while, I make it to the bridge, and I stand there for a little, wondering if I'm really about to do it. It takes me about 15 minutes to finally crawl over the barrier, where I now stand on a tiny ledge, mere inches from my death. I stood there, grabbing onto the barrier for a pretty long time. The night still as dark and as quiet as when I first left my house. When I was finally ready to let go, the high pitched sound of tires screeching to a stop behind me filled my ears. I hadn't heard or seen anyone approaching, so that was odd. The blinding headlights of the car had stopped me from being able to make out any details whatsoever. All I could hear was the door open and shut, and the black silhouette of a man appeared in front of the beams. He was average height, maybe 6 foot. Looked like your average dude, but all I could see. From his pitch black silhouette, I hear him say, "Don't do it. It's not worth it." I remember he spoke a calm, soothing tone. I wasn't sure how to respond. I was nearly on the verge of tears. All I could do was squeeze out a wimpy, "I'm sorry." The man took a step forward and reached his hand out, without saying a word, and although I couldn't see him, I could feel his eyes burning a hole in my soul. After a few minutes, something in me made me grab his hand. I'm still not sure why. I could have easily let go. I could feel his warm, clammy skin on mine, his thin jacket brush against my knuckles as he pulled me up. He grabbed my shoulder as I slid over the barrier with a tight, firm grip. As I was almost all the way over, I flopped to the ground of the cold bridge. I laid there for a minute with my eyes closed, realizing how close I came to actually killing myself. When I noticed I no longer heard the hum of his engine, or the man breathing, or anything, I opened my eyes and nothing. No car, no man, no blinding headlights. I'm absolutely alone. I never heard him get back in his car and leave, and even if I had somehow missed that, the road was fairly straight. I'd see him driving off. I picked myself off the road and brushed myself off. I stood there dazed for a while before I finally made it back home. To this day, I'm not sure who or what stopped me from ending my life, but whatever it was, thank you. Number three. Hello, this is a horrifying true story which happened to me when I went hunting just over a year ago. I live near a forest which is filled with many hogs, which I hunt maybe once a week for family dinner on the weekends. On one Friday night, I went out hunting around 9 p.m. I went looking for the hogs in the forest. There are usually no hunters at this time of the night, but I was surprised to hear footsteps coming from the west side. They didn't sound like animal steps, they sounded slow and heavy like a human, almost stomping on the ground, and they sounded like they were coming towards me. I just assumed best case scenario and that this was just another hunter, until I heard a creepy, demonic sounding laughter not far from me. I'm not a pussy, but I admit this was creeping me out a little bit as I moved away from the direction of the footsteps and laughter. Then things just went silent and I carried on about hunting as usual. Things carried on about as usual. I didn't hear anything for about 10 more minutes, and right when I saw the hog, I heard rapid footsteps again coming towards my direction, and I fired a warning shot to whoever was running at me to back off. The footsteps seemed to alternate directions, and now I was confused and didn't know where they were coming from. Not knowing where the footsteps were coming from meant I virtually ran towards the direction of my car. I'm not a great runner, so my stamina was drained pretty quick. Breathing heavily, I walked casually and slowly towards my car when I thought I had lost the person and saw my car, which was just now visible in the far distance. Walking casually and slowly was the biggest mistake I could have possibly ever made. I heard a creepy whispering coming from behind the trees, and I could hear a hoarse, muffled voice. "You're the one, this is gonna be fun." I felt like my heart was gonna drop. I tried to run as quickly as I could, but I was grabbed swiftly by the neck and by an arm which had gotten me into a chokehold. And now this was no soft chokehold, but by no means was this a weak person, as I felt my airway being crushed by the force of the choke. I do Krav Maga 3 times a week, and knew well how to get out if someone was choking you by the neck. I elbowed the man in the stomach and kicked backwards at his knees. As he let go of the grip, I felt him stumble backwards, and then I spun around and with the momentum smacked the man in the temple with the butt of my Remington 783 rifle. The man was completely knocked out, and I took that time to call the police. This is the even more horrifying part. The police had shown up, and we had pointed the flashlight at the knocked out man, and we were shocked to find a machete on the ground. The man looked to be at least in his 40s. He had a long gray wiry hair and some creepy looking demonic pentagram tattoo on his forehead. The police and I were nothing short of sickened at the sight of him. I still to this day do not know how I am alive. Anyways, it had bloodstains on it, and if you have a weak stomach, do not continue reading. Me and 4 other officers could smell the putrid odor coming not far from us. We walked towards the direction of the smell. What we saw made me want to throw up. It was the rotting corpse of a young looking girl, her neck slashed, which was the bloodstains in the machete, and her eyes gouged out. Even the officers were revolted, and they have seen many bad things during their time. I went home not being able to sleep, and I just couldn't tell my wife and kids about this. The man was taken to the police station and tried for murder. Just remember, be safe when going out in areas like the woods, especially at night, because you don't know what kind of sick people may be out there lurking. Number 4. When I was a young child, about the age of 10, I developed a horrible sleep problem which would haunt me for nearly a decade. For the first 3 years, I would have no idea what was happening to me. To this day, quite frankly, I only have the vaguest idea of what haunted my mind as soon as the sun would go down. I will begin from the start, so please bear with me. There are several events I must establish in order for you to understand how I eventually encountered the mime lurking in my bedroom. It was a humid, smoldering August night, and a violent thunderstorm raged overhead as my family prepared to go to sleep for the night. I remember shooting up in my bed as I heard the distinct guttural churning sound of the power going out. I always hated the dark as a child, and therefore had my parents leave the hallway light on each night to serve as a makeshift nightlight. The first thing I noticed was the sheer silence following the power outage, accompanied by the deep, enveloping dark of the night. My ears rang with the sound of silence, the faint buzzing almost like tinnitus. I felt afraid, and yet, little did I know, the darkness surrounding me would be something I would crave for in the years to come. So I did the only thing a scared child could do in the dark with no electricity late at night. I went to go wake my brother. My house is very small, and my brother's room is adjacent to mine. I crept through the dark. This was the time before kids had cell phones or mobile flashlights, and carefully nudged him until he came out of his deep sleep. My brother had become used to this ordeal. On nights when I found it particularly hard to sleep, or there were too many things going bump in the night, I would wake him to come and join me to sleep in my room. We'd only recently moved into this house, and it was my first time having my own bedroom. As such, I was still adjusting to sleeping in a room by myself. My brother, unafraid of mostly anything, obliged to sleep on the air mattress I had stored in my closet. This would be my last comfortable night for years to come. I awoke something like hours later, must have been around 3 a.m. I had the stinging urge to go pee and the overwhelming sensation of exhaustion begging me to stay in bed. I rolled over and sat up, and that's when I saw it. My brother was standing several feet in front of my bed, staring blankly at my closet door. I called out to him, but he did not respond, nor did he turn to face me. I called out again, this time a little bit louder, and he finally turned to face me. Something was wrong about the way he moved. It was almost as if his movements were stuttered, like that of a character in a flip book who flickers as they move across the page. Then, all at once, he was gone within the blink of an eye. I reached for my bedroom light, hoping power had returned, and it had. Light filled the room, and to my shock and horror, my brother was still asleep on the air mattress. Okay, I thought to myself, must have been dreaming. I shook off the experience and practically forgot about it altogether by the time I woke up the next morning. I brushed off the experience. Kids see a lot of things that might not necessarily be as they appear. I was wrong. So wrong. The following night, I laid in my bed, struggling to fall asleep. Prior to the development of this particular sleep issue, I had dealt with my fair share of nightly problems, including sleepwalking and insomnia. I could feel sweat beating down my cheeks due to the residual heat left over from the hot summer day. I heard the floorboards of my room creaking and my eyes just shot open. On the opposite side of my room, standing in front of the closet, was a large and slender man who I did not recognize. Something about him was off. He was semi-translucent, and his color seemed drained. An almost gray hue enveloped his entire body. He was not looking at me. Instead, his gaze fell upon a painting hanging from my wall. Slowly he began to move closer towards the painting, still not seeming to notice me in the room with him. As he moved, I watched in horror as his movements flickered. His body flashed quickly in and out of existence as he strode across the room. I cannot explain it in any way other than my previous example of the jerky movements associated with characters in a flip book. Then, in another instant, he was completely gone. For some reason, I wasn't afraid. Perhaps I was too sleepy, or maybe I thought I was dreaming. At that time, I thought this was most certainly the probable explanation. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my last thoughts were how the man's movements were exactly the same as my brother's had been the night before. To keep things brief, so that I may get to the heart of the terrifying story, I will gloss over the events for the following few months. Each night I would see these figures, sometimes adults, sometimes children. Two things always remained the same: the way they moved, and the fact I had never seen any of these people before during my waking life. As time went on, they seemed to begin to take notice of me. One night, a little girl sat on the edge of my bed, simply staring and smiling at me. The children never bothered me. It was the adults that gradually began to make me uneasy. There was one night in particular when a tall man in a business suit with a thick mustache watched me from one of the corners of my room. None of these people had ever uttered a word to me, but I was looking towards him, his lips curled into a grotesque shape. He began trembling, and I could tell he was trying to scream. His whole body shook and his mouth quivered in that disgusting manner, but no sound ever came out. Then I began to scream. My mother and father came rushing into my room, and I finally had to tell them what was going on. The man was gone, but I was sure that even if he weren't, that my parents most likely would not have seen him at all. When I told my mom that I had been seeing people in my room for a few months by now, her expression changed into one of fear. By the time the week was over, I was scheduled for a sleep study. One long night in the hospital later, and several weeks of waiting for the results, the test came up with nothing. After the initial sleep study, things grew worse. The figures initially were either passive or indifferent towards my existence, but now they were becoming more and more twisted and filled with anger. My mother, growing increasingly worried, enrolled me in a sleep therapy session. I too was surprised to learn there was such a thing. The first therapist taught me coping skills and even convinced me to try yelling at the figures to leave my room. I worked my way up to approaching them. My therapist thought if I could try to touch one and see they weren't real, perhaps they would go away. On the night I tried to shove an older gentleman out of my room, I found my hands, of course, passing directly through the body to no avail. I was close to giving up. My mother switched my therapist. Someone had to know what was going on. My relationship and encounter with the second therapist was brief, lasting but one session, but will stay with me my entire life. After listening to my description of my nightly events, the therapist, with a look of fear, gave a very bold suggestion. What if the people you're seeing are actually there? What if they just simply exist on a different dimensional plane? I couldn't believe my ears. Was an adult, a professional therapist, actually suggesting that I may in fact be seeing dead people or other worldly spirits in my own bedroom? I'd be lying if I told you that thought hadn't crossed my mind before during the past few years of sleepless nights. He warned me to be very careful and not to let the figures know that I was aware of them, and it was far too late for that. I never got to speak to that therapist again. When he tried to tell my mom his theory, she whisked me out of his office and muttered under her breath as she dragged me towards the car. Several years passed, and in total I've seen 4 different therapists and participated in 6 different types of sleep studies in 6 different hospitals around my state. No one had found a solution to my problem, or even a plausible diagnosis, and I was still seeing ghostly strangers in my room every night. They were growing more and more violent, more sinister, and had some graphic injuries. A woman with the left half of her head missing, seemingly from a self inflicted gunshot wound. Brain matter leaked onto my floor, gray and flickering, but brain matter all the same. That's when I began to unravel. One night, I laid awake in bed, staring hard into the folds of my sheet while doing my best to ignore any figures who may be lingering in my bedroom. I heard the floorboards creaking and simply could not resist the urge to pull my face from under the covers. In front of the closet stood a mime, fully clad in white face paint, with the black triangles above and below his eyes, and a beret resting on his head. His shirt had stripes, and he was wearing black pants. He stood there, smiling a sickening, wide, and sinister crooked smile. Then he lifted his hand and pointed at me. I began screaming, and my dad came running into my room. The mime scurried on all fours towards my wardrobe, and I watched in horror as he flickered slowly up the wall onto the top of the wardrobe. My father was in the room now, and the figure was still there. I pointed at him screaming, and he pointed back in sort of a teasing glance. His jaw unhinged, and I could tell he was laughing as he continued pointing at me. I couldn't hear him, but I knew he was mocking me. My dad could not see him, of course. He turned on the lights. The mime was gone. My dad stayed for about 20 minutes, then went back to his room. My parents knew there was little they could do. When he switched off the lights again, and the color drained from my face. The mime was still resting atop the wardrobe. None of these figures had ever lingered this long before. They were always gone with a minute or two of me sighting them, and never would return after turning the bedroom lights back out. Yet he was still there, still laughing, still pointing. He shook his head at me and made clucking motions with his tongue. Slowly he descended from atop the wardrobe, still on all four. He made his way out of my room, and I could hear him on the stairs, creaking as he descended further into my home. I did not see him again that night, and I felt relief knowing he was somewhere else, and found comfort in knowing that I've never seen one of these figures more than once. They were constantly changing, and always a new stranger. The next night I awoke to a faint sound. It was my name being called out in the dark by a hushed whisper. It sounded like a young girl's voice. I looked around, seeing nothing in my room. I could find no source of the sound, or no little girl. Confused, I laid there. I have never heard one of these things speak to me before, let alone utter a single noise. Something felt horribly wrong. Dread seeped into my bones, and I heard him creak. This creak wasn't from my floorboards, nor from the stairs in the hallway. The creak came from above me, hanging from the ceiling, somehow by all fours. It was the mime. He was directly above me, and he grasped at the ceiling with both of his hands and feet in an impossible feat of physical prowess. His smile was that disgusting twisted smirk that curled at the corners. In his right hand was a large knife. It was then that it dropped from the ceiling and onto me. I struggled to get out of my bed, becoming entangled in the sheets. Something was scratching me, but I was too frantic to know what or where. I searched for my voice and found none. Everything went completely dark. Did I lose consciousness? No, I could hear something very faint. It almost sounded like a whisper, growing louder and louder until it was a blood-curdling scream. I felt something pulling me, and it was then that I snapped back into reality and fully realized the screams were emanating from my own vocal cords. I was by my window now, and I found myself in my mother's arms. Hyperventilating and shaking, I could not bring myself to tell my parents what I had seen. As I began to calm down a bit, through my teary eyes I could see there were deep holes in the shape of crescent moons in my windowsill. I noticed a lot of blood. I looked down at my hands and could see the tips of my fingers were gushing blood. I had tried to jump out of my second story window, clawing my way against the windowsill. I was horrified. My nails left deep half-moon creases in the wood which would stay forever. A day or two later, I was playing in my room in the daytime, where I looked up and spotted where the mime had been hanging from the night before. There were two large handprints on the ceiling where he had been, in location far too high for my little hands to reach even if I jumped on my bed. No, these were certainly not my handprints. They were large, and as I looked closer, I could see what there should have been round fingertips. There were marks of jagged long claws. I was mortified. After showing my parents, they tried to reassure me that the handprints had to have been my own. I knew they weren't, and they couldn't have. It's been almost a decade since I've seen that mime, and my sleep disturbances gradually have lessened as I grew older. The gashes in the wood of the windowsill remain, and though not for lack of trying to remove them, the handprints remain in the ceiling above where I slept. Trust me, we've tried everything to get them out.